Instead, he's going with fear of immigrants. Ironically, immigration is how modern America was built, right? Both during and after slavery, someone had to replace all that free labor, and immigrants fit the bill. Most of us here today, unless you are indigenous American, come from a family of immigrants. And yet, there's always been resistance by the old immigrants to the new people. There was the Know Nothing Party of the 1850s, the America First Nazi Curious movement in the 1930s, and now we have Donald Trump, who has decided to make fear-mongering about immigration the center of his entire campaign, with fascistic rhetoric like promising the largest mass deportation operation in history and promising it would be a bloody story, spreading racist lies about immigrants eating people's pets, and even talking about giving immigrants serial numbers, Nazi style. At this point, his entire plan is trying to scare people into voting for him, despite 2 of his 3 wives being immigrants. And just to remind you, as we talk about this, border crossings are actually down to the lowest levels in 4 years. Violent crimes also way down across the country. And everything you hear on right-wing media to suggest otherwise is a lie. There is no migrant crime wave. Immigrants actually commit fewer crimes than people born in the U.S. They also don't eat pets. But the facts don't matter to Trump. Instead, he just keeps ramping up the rhetoric more and more every day. Here's what he said today at what was supposed to be a speech about the economy in Michigan.
These are killers. These are people at the highest level of killing that cut your throat, and they won't even think about it the next morning. A lot of gang members, they take their gangs off the street. Like in Caracas, Venezuela, the criminals have all been brought to the United States. She let our American sons and daughters be raped and murdered at the hands of vicious monsters. She let American communities be conquered. They're conquering your communities. We have to get them the hell out of our country because they're ruining the fabric of our country.
Okay, and then on the other side of this adjudicated sexual assaulter / rapist and 34-count felon, on the other side of that ironic dude, you have Vice President Kamala Harris, the daughter of 2 immigrants. Right now, she's in the swing state of Arizona, visiting the southern border for the first time since she became the Democratic nominee. Harris met with Border Patrol agents and will receive a briefing on efforts to curb the flow of fentanyl. You know, presidential stuff. Now compare that to Donald Trump's super awkward meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky earlier today. Later this hour, the VP will also speak on immigration, where she'll likely highlight her record prosecuting transnational gangs and drug traffickers as California Attorney General. She's also expected to go after Trump for killing the bipartisan border deal earlier this year just because he wanted to run on the issue. But despite all of this, recent polling has shown a majority of voters say they trust Trump more when it comes to dealing with the border. A man who doesn't know the difference between political asylum and an insane asylum, and whose plans to deport every immigrant, or anyone who just looks like an immigrant, would send our economy into a free fall. Because fear, whether real or irrational, can be an effective political tactic. The question now for America is, have we gotten to the point where we would destroy our own economy and walk willingly into a Hitlerian dictatorship because of the fear Donald Trump and his MAGA cronies are perpetuating solely for their own political benefit? Joining me now is Olivia Troy, a member of Republicans for Harris, who previously served as the Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to former Vice President Mike Pence. And Ray Suarez, host of the podcast On Shifting Ground, and author of We Are Home, Becoming American in the 21st Century, An Oral History. An apt book, Ray Suarez. I am going to start with you because this is the irony of all of this, is that this is a country that wouldn't exist in its present form without immigrants. It certainly wouldn't without slavery, but set aside slavery, that's not immigration. After that, when the slaves were free, they still needed workers. So they went all around the world and they attracted people here literally to work because workers are what built the economy and what built the country. And yet each new group of immigrants says, ooh, we don't want those new people. Oh, gosh, we don't want them. You're even seeing that, Mr. Suarez, among some Latinos who also want to shut the border and kick people out and even mass deport them. Why is that?
But, you know, critically, Joy, part of this story is that the first century plus of immigration was almost solely from Europe. And then, as American law changed in the 20th century, people started to come here from more places in the world. So that created a bifurcated, stratified immigrant population in this country where most of the new people are non-white, and most of the people with pictures of their grandparents and great-grandparents, sepia-toned photographs lovingly kept on mantelpieces, those people are almost exclusively European. And that sets up a difficult social change for us now as the new folks, 9 out of the 10 sending countries of people born in another place in the world are sending non-white immigrants to the United States. That's a really important part of understanding the unease we're having about this right now.
Yeah, and I mean, Olivia, during the Trump administration, when you were working in the administration, I mean, Jeff Sessions, when he was Attorney General, he is an open supporter of the 1927, I believe, Immigration Act, which essentially was, to Mr. Suarez's point, the goal of it was to shut down immigration from everywhere but Europe, was to say we don't even want Southern Europeans. They didn't even want Italians. They certainly didn't want Asians. They certainly didn't want Africans, North Africans, et cetera. The idea was to whiten immigration. And of course, it was Reagan who did the opposite. 3 million people given open amnesty by Ronald Reagan. And those people were largely non-white. They were largely Mexican migrants. So how do you square a party where Ronald Reagan did amnesty, where George Herbert Walker Bush was very open about saying we welcome immigration, we want immigrants, and where George W. Bush said the same and even made positive noises about Muslim and Arab immigration, to this?
Well, I think the fact of the matter is that Republican Party of the past is gone, Joy. I mean, that's the bottom line. What it is today is a complete fear-mongering, anti-immigrant sentiment. And, you mentioned Jeff Sessions. That brought back a lot of memories of the immigration meetings I was in. I spent all 4 years of the Trump administration working the immigration portfolio, when we could spend hours talking about the things that I witnessed and the things that were said. And it wasn't Jeff Sessions, I'll be very clear, because just remember Stephen Miller was a big proponent of all these things. And so when I hear actually Donald Trump speaking the way he is this week, the way he has been the past couple of weeks, he actually sounds like Stephen Miller did in actual immigration policy meetings at the very highest levels. I'm talking about cabinet meetings, Joy, where traditionally you would not hear this type of language being spoken, but this is how he would speak. He would talk in this manner, and he would encourage fear because that's the only thing he had, right? And then he would push these extreme policies. And so I think in the contrast here, when we're looking at this and the Republican Party of today under Donald Trump, which breaks my heart, right, as a lifelong Republican and as a daughter of a Mexican immigrant who believed in the Republican Party of the past, watching what is happening here is so just detrimental to who we are as a country. And it's also dangerous, as we're seeing with all the threats that we're seeing throughout the country when they push these messages out.
Right. And the reality is, Ray, that, there was an attempt by Republicans. So a lot of this is an internal Republican struggle, because Democrats have always been for immigration reform and have always been like, we're ready. Whenever you are, we'll pass it. We will easily pass it. Republicans got together and negotiated a very, very conservative border patrol bill, a bill that would have, largely closed the border. It was going to pass. Let me let you listen to what Republicans say happened to that bill.
So everybody who comes on this floor and says our border's broken, we should do something about it, you're absolutely right. And unfortunately, we didn't get there. President Trump opposed a Senate bill.
And then our nominee for president didn't seem to want us to do anything at all.
After President Trump said don't fix anything during the presidential election, it's the single biggest issue during the election, don't resolve this, we'll resolve it next year. Quite a few of my colleagues backed up, looked for a reason to be able to shoot against it, and then walked away.
The fact that he would communicate to Republican senators and congresspeople that he doesn't want us to solve the border problem because he wants to blame Biden for it is really appalling.
And so if people are so exercised on the Republican side, it's really Republicans who are mostly exercised about this, Ray, then why aren't they blaming Donald Trump for not having a border bill?
Well, they're implicitly blaming him. You just heard, after all, the leader of Republicans in the Senate acknowledge the former president's opposition to the bill.
But I mean
There seemed
voters.
to
I'm
be
so sorry. I
very
mean
little
voters.
outrage.
Why
I mean,
aren't-
even Senator Langford from Oklahoma, one of the most conservative members of the United States Senate, was pretty mild in his assessment. He admitted that was what was happened. Donald Trump threw a monkey wrench in the gears, and that's just what happened. And life was supposed to move on. It's really something.
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, Olivia, it is sort of, it's hard, I think, for people who probably watch this show and watch MSNBC to understand why voters look at Donald Trump and they look at the failures and they also look at the successes. Let me show you. Illegal border crossings fell in July. They're at the lowest level they are in 4 years. That's just a fact. And so the reality that people are seeing on Fox, this idea that immigrants are running through the country murdering people, it's just not true. Let me play one more thing that we also see happening. This is the idea that immigration is somehow tied to people's lives, even if they're not in a border place. The great Alex Wagner, she she talked to union members in Michigan. Let me let you listen to what some of them said. This is cut 3 from my director.
There are thousands and thousands of illegal immigrants coming across the border every day, and the vice president has done minimal work to fix that based on what I've seen. So I'd like that to change.
Do you feel like Donald Trump's going to be better on that issue?
Based on what we've seen on his first 4 years, I do believe that he will be better on that, yeah.
Are you leaning towards Trump right now?
Yes, ma'am.
Is there anything that Vice President Harris could do at this point to change your mind?
Not particularly, no. Unless she changes her stance completely on fixing the border, that's no.
Olivia, based on what we've seen in his first 4 years, I do believe he'll be better on that. Based on what? The only things that we saw in terms of immigration, as you talked about with Stephen Miller, were taking babies out of the hands of their moms at the border and separating them and sending them off in 2 different directions and losing track of them. You saw a lot of cruelty. You saw a lot of talk about S-hole countries. He didn't build a wall, and border crossings are lower now than they were then. What are people seeing? What reality are they living in?
Well, therein lies the problem, Joy. I think it's just because the fear mongering and all of these narratives, they work when the right-wing media machine is coming together and pushing that, and that's all they're seeing. And so this is a product of disinformation that they're continuing to push, devoid of policy or facts, right? Because when Donald Trump gets up there and gives these speeches, all he does is spread this divisive, hateful rhetoric on immigrants, but he's not actually telling you what he's going to do to solve the border crisis, right? He's not talking about international asylum cooperation agreements. He's not talking about actual foreign policy that could decrease migration. He's not talking about perhaps funding law enforcement on the border, which is what Kamala Harris is doing. She's actually saying, I will support that bipartisan bill. I will fund border security. I will support CBP at the border. This is what I want to do. I'm going to slow fentanyl. She's actually talking concrete policies. But the problem is that I think that it's easier to sell a narrative on a very complicated issue like immigration by instilling fear and instilling that in communities and getting people to be divided. And so I think that's what you're seeing there is just that what he says is resonating in communities. Now, the problem with that is that what does Donald Trump's immigration proposal actually look like in the future? It's going to look like encampments. What is it going to look like when they're putting people in encampments on the borders or in these cities where they're shipping them around? Yeah. What's it going to look like when they're targeting just anyone who looks potentially like a minority in general and taking these kids out of schools and corralling them? And what is it going to look like when they're going after legal residents, right? Because denaturalization was actually discussed in the Trump administration, where they don't actually differentiate between a legal resident alien and someone who is here illegally sometimes. Those were actual policy discussions that were had. And so I think, to me, to someone who actually believes in legal immigration, wants to fix the immigration system, this is all just bluster. And, it's sad to see that Americans don't understand it.
Well, I'll tell you what it will look like. It will look like concentration camps in Germany in the 1930s, because that's what you call it when you put somebody in a camp with means to separate them from society. It's called a concentration camp. Olivia Troy, Ray Suarez, thank you both very much.